June 15, 1944, 22:47 hours, RAF, Biggin Hill, Kent, England. Squadron leader James Mitchell stood at the anti-aircraft battery control post, watching tracers arc into the night sky. Another V-1 flying bomb buzzed overhead like a demonic motorcycle, its pulse jet engine creating the distinctive sound Londoners had learned to dread. The sound of Hitler's Vergeltungswaffe, vengeance weapon. Mitchell's guns fired. 37 shells, 3,000 pounds of high explosive hurled skyward. The V-1 continued on course, untouched, heading towards central London, where it would detonate and kill perhaps a dozen people, maybe more. This was the fourth V-1 his battery had engaged that night. They had hit none of them. The mathematics were brutal. British anti-aircraft guns were downing approximately 24% of incoming V-1s. Not good enough. Not nearly good enough. At current rates, the flying bombs would continue massacring London civilians indefinitely. But 48 hours later, everything changed. On June 17th, American-supplied anti-aircraft shells arrived at British batteries throughout southern England. Same guns, same crews, same training, different ammunition. That night, squadron leader Mitchell's battery engaged 6 V-1 flying bombs. They destroyed 5. 83% kill rate in one night. Mitchell examined the new American shells with confusion. They looked identical to British ammunition, except for markings indicating U.S. manufacture. Nothing obviously different, no visible modifications. Yet somehow, impossibly, they were hitting targets that had been nearly untouchable just days earlier. What Mitchell didn't know, what couldn't be told even to the crews firing these miracle shells, was that each round contained a secret, so valuable that using it over land where it might fall into enemy hands had been forbidden until that desperate June. Inside every shell was a miniature radio transmitter, receiver, and battery-powered circuit. Technology so advanced that German and Japanese engineers would never successfully replicate it despite capturing unexploded examples. A weapon so effective that it would shoot down 82% of V-1s, destroy hundreds of Japanese aircraft, and revolutionize warfare. The Americans called it the variable time fuze, VT for short. But everyone knew what VT really stood for. Proximity fuse. The shell that knew when to explode. And the Germans never understood how it worked. This is the story of the most significant technological advantage of World War II that you've probably never heard about. How American scientists miniaturized radar into an artillery shell. How a weapon so secret it couldn't be used in Europe until D-Day saved London from Hitler's vengeance weapons. How Japanese kamikaze pilots faced an invisible enemy that detonated shells around their aircraft without needing direct hits. The story of how proximity fuses changed warfare forever, and how the Axis powers, despite their vaunted technical superiority, never came close to matching American innovation. By June 1944, Nazi Germany was losing the war, but Hitler had promised vengeance. The V-1 flying bomb was his answer. The Feisler Fe-103, designated V-1 by German propaganda, was history's first cruise missile. 25 feet long, 17-foot wingspan, 1-ton warhead, powered by a pulse jet engine producing that characteristic buzzing sound. Launched from ramps in occupied France, aimed at London, simple and deadly. The V-1 flew at 400 miles per hour at altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet, fast enough that most fighters struggled to intercept, low enough that radar detection provided minimal warning, and produced cheaply enough that Germany could launch them by the thousands. Beginning June 13, 1944, exactly 1 week after D-Day, V-1s began falling on London at a rate of over 100 per day. By the end of June, nearly 2,500 had been launched. They killed over 6,000 people and wounded 18,000 more in the first month alone. British air defenses struggled desperately. Fighter aircraft could sometimes catch V-1s, but the flying bomb's speed made interception difficult. Diving Spitfires and Tempests had to position perfectly to shoot them down before they reached the city. Anti-aircraft guns were even less effective. The problem was fundamental. Hitting a small, fast-moving target at altitude required the shell to detonate at exactly the right moment. Traditional shells used timed fuses, calculated estimates of how long the shell would take to reach the target altitude. But calculations were imperfect. If the fuse timing was off by even half a second, the shell exploded hundreds of feet from the target. And V-1s didn't fly in predictable patterns. They wobbled slightly, varied altitude, and moved too fast for gun crews to adjust fire effectively. The result? 24% hit rate. 3 out of 4 V-1s got through. London was being slowly demolished by weapons that British defenses couldn't stop. Unknown to British commanders watching their capital burn, American scientists had already solved the problem. They'd solved it in 1940, and they'd been testing it in the Pacific for a year. The proximity fuse was born from a 1940 British request. As the Battle of Britain raged, British scientists asked America for help developing a fuse that could detonate near aircraft without requiring direct hits. The challenge seemed impossible. A fuse would need to detect an aircraft at sufficient distance to detonate effectively, survive being fired from a gun, forces exceeding 20,000 times gravity, function reliably after violent acceleration, operate on battery power for the few seconds of shell flight, cost little enough to be mass-produced, and be small enough to fit inside a standard artillery shell. Multiple approaches were attempted. Photoelectric cells that detected changes in light, acoustic sensors triggered by engine noise, capacitive sensors that detected changes in electrical fields. All failed. Too unreliable, too fragile, too expensive. Then, scientists at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, working with the National Bureau of Standards, developed a different approach: miniature radar. Radar was already revolutionizing warfare. Large ground-based systems could detect aircraft at great distances. The British had used radar to win the Battle of Britain. But radar systems filled rooms. They required massive antennas and power supplies. Fitting radar into an artillery shell 3 inches in diameter seemed ludicrous, but American engineers achieved it. The final design was a masterpiece of miniaturization. A tiny radio transmitter broadcast a signal forward from the nose of the shell. If an aircraft was nearby, the signal reflected back. A receiver detected this reflection. When the reflected signal reached sufficient strength, indicating the shell was close enough to the target, an electronic circuit triggered the detonator. The entire system, transmitter, receiver, battery, amplifier, and firing circuit, fit into a package smaller than a coffee cup. It had to survive 20,000 G-forces during firing, function for the few seconds of shell flight, and reliably detect aircraft in all weather conditions. The technical challenges were enormous. Vacuum tubes, the only electronic components available in 1940, were fragile. They shattered under high G-forces. Engineers had to develop ruggedized tubes that could survive gun launch. The battery had to provide power instantly after experiencing violent acceleration. The antenna had to be small enough to fit in the fuse nose, yet effective enough to detect aircraft. Each problem was solved through patient engineering. Special vacuum tubes with reinforced filaments, reserve battery chemistry activated by centrifugal force during shell spin, miniature antennas optimized for the transmission frequency. By 1942, the proximity fuse worked. Test after test showed it could detect aircraft and detonate at optimal range.
The kill radius of an anti-aircraft shell increased from requiring a direct hit to being effective within 70 feet of the target. But there was a problem: absolute secrecy. The proximity fuse was so valuable that it couldn't be risked falling into enemy hands. If Germany or Japan recovered an intact fuse and reverse-engineered it, they could deploy their own. Worse, they could develop countermeasures. Therefore, the fuse could only be used over water, where unexploded shells would sink and remain unrecoverable. Over land, traditional timed fuses had to be used, no matter how inferior. This restriction meant the weapon that could have saved countless Allied bombers over Germany sat unused in European warehouses, while American and British aircraft were torn apart by German flak. But in the Pacific, proximity fuses revolutionized naval warfare. The first combat use occurred in January 1943. The cruiser USS Helena engaged Japanese aircraft during the Battle of Rennell Island. Her 5-inch guns, equipped with proximity-fused shells, achieved unprecedented kill rates. Japanese pilots had never encountered anything like it. They were accustomed to anti-aircraft fire that created black puffs of smoke, shells detonating at preset altitudes, creating a barrage they could dodge. But Helena's shells detonated precisely when aircraft came near, creating lethal fragmentation clouds that were impossible to avoid. The effect was devastating. Aircraft that would have survived traditional anti-aircraft fire were shredded by shells that detonated at optimal range. The Helena's gunners watched in amazement as their shells destroyed targets they hadn't even aimed at perfectly. The proximity fuse compensated for minor targeting errors. Word spread quickly through the Pacific Fleet. The VT fuse was a war winner. By late 1943, proximity fuses were standard issue for Pacific naval forces. The impact on Japanese air attacks was catastrophic. Their pilots had developed tactics for evading traditional anti-aircraft fire: altitude changes, jinking maneuvers, coordinated attacks to overwhelm defenses. None of it worked against proximity fuses. Kill rates for naval anti-aircraft guns increased from roughly 5% with timed fuses to over 30% with proximity fuses, a 6-fold improvement. Suddenly, American ships could defend themselves effectively against massed air attacks. But the real test came during the kamikaze campaigns of 1944-1945. When Japanese pilots began deliberate suicide attacks, proximity fuses became the primary defense. A kamikaze had to be destroyed before reaching the ship. Wounding the pilot or damaging the aircraft wasn't enough. They would continue their dive. The plane had to be shattered completely. Proximity fuses excelled at this. Shells detonated close enough to the aircraft to destroy it, not just damage it. Kamikaze attacks that should have succeeded were stopped by shells that exploded in the perfect position to disintegrate the incoming aircraft. American naval officers calculated that without proximity fuses, kamikaze attacks would have sunk or crippled twice as many ships. The fuses were literally saving the fleet. Yet this miracle weapon remained forbidden in Europe. Over land, where shells might be recovered, proximity fuses stayed in storage until the V1s started falling.
By mid-June 1944, the situation in London was desperate. V1s were hitting the city faster than defenses could stop them. Civilian morale was cracking. Churchill faced pressure to divert resources from the Normandy invasion to deal with the flying bomb threat. American military leadership made a calculated decision. The strategic situation justified the risk. V1s had to be stopped, even if it meant using proximity fuses where they might be recovered. The first shipment of VT-fused anti-aircraft ammunition arrived at British batteries on June 16, 1944. Crews were told only that this was new American ammunition with improved performance. They weren't told how it worked. They weren't told it contained miniature radar. The results were immediate and spectacular. On June 17th, British anti-aircraft batteries using proximity fused shells achieved an 82% kill rate against V-1 flying bombs. 82%, compared to 24% the previous week. V-1s that had been nearly impossible to hit were being blown out of the sky in droves. Crews watched in amazement as shells detonated perfectly positioned to destroy the incoming missiles. The flying bomb's speed no longer mattered. Their evasive maneuvers didn't help. The proximity fuses found them and killed them. German intelligence was baffled. Suddenly, British anti-aircraft fire had become lethally effective. Reports from V-1 launch crews indicated that fewer than 1 in 5 flying bombs were reaching London. Something had changed, but what? Crashed V-1s that had been shot down were examined. The damage patterns were consistent with proximity detonation, but German analysts assumed this was coincidence or improved British gunnery. The concept of a radio proximity fuse was so advanced that German scientists didn't seriously consider it. Several unexploded proximity fused shells were recovered from the English countryside. They were shipped to German research facilities for analysis, and German scientists couldn't figure them out. The miniaturization was beyond anything German electronics had achieved. The ruggedized vacuum tubes made no sense. How could such fragile components survive gun launch? The battery chemistry was unfamiliar. The circuit design was sophisticated beyond German expectations. Even holding the complete device, even taking it apart piece by piece, German engineers couldn't understand the full operational principle. They recognized it was some sort of proximity sensor, but couldn't determine exactly how it functioned, or how to replicate it. Reports sent to the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the German Air Ministry, acknowledged that the Allies had developed a proximity fuse, but recommended against attempting to copy it. The technology was too advanced, too complex, and too expensive for German industry to replicate in wartime conditions. This decision may have been the correct one. Germany lacked the industrial capacity, rare materials, and specialized expertise to mass-produce proximity fuses. Even if they'd fully understood the design, manufacturing millions of units would have been impossible given German industrial constraints in 1944. But the result was that German forces faced a weapon they couldn't counter. As Allied forces advanced through France in late 1944, proximity fuses remained in use. The restriction against land use was quietly dropped. The technology was too valuable, and the risk of German replication was deemed acceptable given their obvious inability to copy it. American artillery units began receiving VT-fused shells. The effect on German forces was devastating. Traditional artillery created a dilemma. Shells that detonated on impact were effective for infantry in the open, but useless against troops in trenches or foxholes. Shells with timed fuses could create airbursts above trenches, but timing had to be perfect and adjusted for each target. Proximity fuses solved this completely. Shells automatically detonated at optimal height above the ground, typically 20 to 30 feet, high enough to spread fragments over a wide area, low enough that trenches provided no protection. German infantry called them American terror shells. Soldiers who had survived years on the Eastern Front reported that American proximity-fused artillery was more frightening than anything they'd experienced. Traditional artillery could be survived by taking cover. Proximity-fused shells found you anywhere. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 showcased proximity fuses at their most effective. German forces attacking through the Ardennes expected their winter offensive to succeed partially because bad weather would ground Allied aircraft. They didn't account for proximity-fused artillery. American artillery units defending Bastogne and other key positions used VT fuses to devastating effect. German infantry advancing across open ground were shredded by airbursts they couldn't avoid. Attacks that might have succeeded against traditional artillery were stopped cold. German commanders reported that American artillery fire had become qualitatively more effective. They attributed this to improved American gunnery, better fire control, and increased ammunition supply. Few realized they were facing a technological revolution. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding a reconnaissance battalion, wrote in his combat diary in January 1945, "American artillery has become impossible to assault against. Their shells detonate above ground regardless of terrain. Our men cannot hide in depressions, cannot use trenches effectively, cannot advance across open ground. The American gunners seem to have perfected airburst techniques that we cannot match. Casualties from artillery have tripled since December. We cannot explain this development." He was experiencing proximity fuses. The Germans never developed effective countermeasures because they never fully understood what they faced. Electronic jamming might have disrupted the radar fuses, but German forces didn't realize radar was involved. They had no jamming equipment designed for the frequency bands proximity fuses used. In the Pacific theater, proximity fuses reached their ultimate effectiveness against kamikaze attacks during the Okinawa campaign in spring 1945. Between April and June 1945, Japanese forces launched over 1,900 kamikaze sorties against the American fleet off Okinawa. These suicide attacks represented Japan's last hope of inflicting sufficient casualties to force a negotiated peace. American ships responded with proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire of unprecedented density. The guns didn't need direct hits. Shells that passed within 70 feet of a kamikaze detonated automatically, shredding the aircraft with fragments. The kill rate was extraordinary. The 5-inch guns on American destroyers and cruisers, equipped with VT fuses, destroyed kamikazes at rates approaching 40% per engagement. When combined with the smaller 40mm and 20mm guns for close-in defense, the layered defense proved devastatingly effective. Japanese pilots who survived early sorties reported that American anti-aircraft fire had become supernaturally accurate. Shells seemed to explode precisely where aircraft were flying, as if the Americans could predict their movements. In reality, proximity fuses were eliminating the prediction requirement. The shells found the aircraft automatically. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet responsible for kamikaze operations, wrote in his diary in May 1945, "Our pilots report that American anti-aircraft shells detonate even when they miss. Multiple pilots describe shells exploding near their aircraft without visible direct hits. We cannot explain this phenomenon. American gunnery has improved beyond what training alone could account for. There may be a technical factor we do not understand." He was correct. There was a technical factor, and Japan would never understand it. Japanese scientists also recovered unexploded proximity-fused shells. Like the Germans, they attempted reverse engineering. Like the Germans, they failed. The problem wasn't just understanding the device, it was replicating the manufacturing capability. Even if Japanese engineers had perfectly understood proximity fuse operation, Japan's electronics industry in 1945 couldn't produce the components. The miniature vacuum tubes required manufacturing precision that Japanese factories couldn't achieve. The specialized materials weren't available. The quality control necessary for reliable fuse operation exceeded Japanese industrial standards. A post-war report by Japanese technical intelligence concluded, "The American proximity fuse represents industrial capacity and technical sophistication beyond our capability to match. We identified the operating principle, but could not replicate the design with available resources. This single weapon exemplifies why material defeat was inevitable." The proximity fuse's impact on the war can be measured statistically. American analysis after the war estimated that VT fuses increased the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire by 300 to 600%, depending on target type and engagement conditions. Against V-1 flying bombs, kill rate increased from 24% to 82%, a 240% improvement. Against conventional aircraft, kill rate increased from approximately 5% to 30 to 40%, a 600 to 800% improvement. Against kamikaze operations, estimated that proximity fuses prevented approximately 1,000 successful kamikaze hits that would have occurred with traditional ammunition. In artillery use, casualties inflicted per shell increased by an estimated 200 to 300% compared to timed fuses. These aren't minor improvements. These are revolutionary advantages that fundamentally changed combat outcomes. The production numbers tell another story of American industrial dominance. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States manufactured over 22 million proximity fuses. 22 million miniature radar systems, each one a precision instrument containing vacuum tubes, batteries, and electronic circuits. The cost per fuse decreased from approximately $700 in 1942 to less than $20 by 1945 through mass production and manufacturing improvements. At peak production, American factories produced over 100,000 proximity fuses daily. Germany and Japan combined couldn't have produced 100,000 of these devices in the entire war, let alone daily. The industrial capacity gap wasn't just quantity, it was capability. American factories could mass-produce advanced electronics that Axis industry couldn't manufacture even in small batches. The proximity fuse remained classified long after the war ended. Details weren't publicly disclosed until the 1950s. Even today, many people don't realize that World War II artillery shells contained miniature radar systems. But the technology's impact extended far beyond the war. Proximity fuses revolutionized air defense permanently. Every modern anti-aircraft missile uses descendants of the VT fuse. The concept of sensing target proximity and detonating at optimal range is now fundamental to weapons design. The Manhattan Project gets historical attention as the war's greatest scientific achievement, but the proximity fuse affected more combat outcomes. Atomic bombs ended the war. Proximity fuses helped win it by improving the effectiveness of conventional weapons across all theaters. British scientists who studied captured German technical reports after the war found that German researchers had attempted proximity fuse development. Multiple programs had explored radio-based, acoustic, and optical sensors. All failed. The German programs foundered on the same problems American scientists had solved: miniaturization, ruggedization, and reliability. German electronics simply weren't advanced enough. Their vacuum tube technology couldn't produce components that survived gun launch. Their battery technology couldn't provide sufficient power in compact packages. Their quality control couldn't achieve the reliability necessary for combat use. A German researcher's report from 1944, discovered in captured files, acknowledged, "The American proximity fuse capability exceeds our current technical achievement by what we estimate as 5 to 7 years. We cannot replicate this technology with available resources and industrial capacity. Recommend defensive measures rather than attempting to copy the design." Those defensive measures never materialized because Germany didn't fully understand what it was defending against. In Japan, the story was similar but more desperate. Japanese scientists knew proximity fuses existed. They had recovered examples. They had examined the circuitry. They simply couldn't build them. Japanese electronics industry in 1945 was primitive compared to American capabilities. While the United States had vast industrial capacity for radio production, electronics manufacturing, and precision components, Japan struggled to produce basic vacuum tubes in sufficient quantity for radios. A Japanese technical intelligence officer interrogated after the war stated, "We understood that American shells contained proximity sensors. We recovered several examples and determined they used radio detection. But we could not build similar devices. Our industry could not produce the components. The miniaturization alone was beyond our capability. Even if we had complete blueprints and unlimited resources, we estimated 3 to 5 years would be required to develop manufacturing capability. By then, the war would be over." It was. The proximity fuse's secrecy was maintained so successfully that most American soldiers and sailors using them didn't know how they worked. Crews were told the ammunition was improved, but not why. The VT designation was deliberately vague. It could mean variable time, which implied better timing mechanisms rather than revolutionary technology. This secrecy paid strategic dividends. Because German and Japanese forces didn't understand proximity fuses, they couldn't develop effective countermeasures. They couldn't warn their pilots about specific evasive techniques. They couldn't deploy jamming equipment. They just died in larger numbers and couldn't explain why. The psychological impact was significant. German and Japanese military personnel facing proximity-fused fire reported that American gunnery seemed supernatural. Shells that knew where aircraft were and detonated perfectly positioned seemed like magic. This reinforced the perception of American technical superiority and contributed to declining Axis morale. Post-war interviews with German and Japanese veterans consistently revealed that they attributed American combat effectiveness to better training, more ammunition, and superior coordination. Few realized they'd faced weapons that were technologically a generation ahead. The proximity fuse story reveals a broader truth about World War II. American victory wasn't just about production quantity. It was about technical quality. The United States didn't just build more weapons than the Axis, it built better weapons, more innovative weapons, weapons that enemies couldn't match even when they understood the principles. The Germans had excellent engineers who designed sophisticated weapons like the V-2 rocket and jet aircraft, but they couldn't miniaturize radar into an artillery shell. They couldn't mass-produce precision electronics. They couldn't achieve the quality control necessary for reliable proximity fuses. The Japanese had skilled technicians who built excellent aircraft and warships, but they couldn't manufacture the vacuum tubes, batteries, and circuits that proximity fuses required. They couldn't match American electronics capability. American industry could, and did. 22 million times. Admiral Nimitz later wrote that the proximity fuse was one of the 3 most valuable technologies of the war, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. Unlike the atomic bomb, which ended the war, proximity fuses helped win it by making conventional weapons dramatically more effective. The proximity fuse saved lives. American and Allied lives that would have been lost to V-1s, kamikaze attacks, and enemy aircraft that would have gotten through traditional defenses. It shortened battles by making American firepower more lethal. It forced Axis forces to avoid tactics that proximity-fused weapons countered. And the enemy never figured out the secret. German scientists after the war admitted that even with captured examples, they didn't fully understand VT fuses until Americans explained the technology. Japanese engineers similarly confessed that they'd identified the general principle but couldn't grasp the manufacturing techniques that made mass production possible. This knowledge gap persisted even after the war. Soviet forces recovered thousands of unexploded proximity-fused shells from European battlefields. They reverse-engineered them and developed their own versions, but not until the early 1950s. The 5-year delay demonstrated how advanced American technology had been. The proximity fuse remained relevant long after World War II. Korea saw extensive use of VT-fused artillery. Vietnam used improved versions. Modern air defense systems all incorporate descendants of the original design. But the weapon's finest hour was June 1944 to August 1945. 18 months when American proximity fuses shot down thousands of aircraft, destroyed thousands of V-1s, and killed tens of thousands of Axis soldiers who never understood what hit them. Squadron leader James Mitchell, the British officer who witnessed the transformation of anti-aircraft effectiveness in June 1944, wrote in his memoirs 50 years later, "We went from hitting 1 in 4 V-1s to hitting 4 in 5 overnight. Same guns, same crews, different shells. The Americans had given us ammunition that seemed to think for itself. We didn't understand how it worked. We didn't need to. We just loaded it and fired it and watched the flying bombs explode. After months of helplessly watching V-1s sail over our guns toward London, suddenly we could stop them. The relief was indescribable. He never learned about the miniature radar in those shells. The secret was kept that well. German V-1 crews launching flying bombs from sites in France noticed the declining success rate, but attributed it to improved British defenses and pilot interception. They never knew that American technology had made their weapons obsolete. Japanese kamikaze pilots who survived early missions reported increasingly effective American anti-aircraft fire, but assumed it was due to more guns and better training. They never knew they faced shells that could sense their aircraft and detonate at optimal range. The proximity fuse was the invisible weapon. It killed without being seen. It changed battles without being acknowledged. It won the war while remaining secret. And it represented something larger: American ability to translate scientific knowledge into mass-produced weapons faster and better than any other nation. The Manhattan Project demonstrated American capability at the highest level of physics. The proximity fuse demonstrated American capability at the practical level of engineering and manufacturing. Both mattered, but only one affected thousands of battles across two theaters of war. When the war ended in August 1945, proximity fuse production ceased. Millions of shells were stored or destroyed as surplus. The scientists and engineers who developed them moved on to new projects. The technology became declassified gradually over the following decades. But for one critical period in history, the proximity fuse gave Allied forces an invisible advantage that enemy forces couldn't match. An advantage so complete that even when the Axis recovered examples and studied them, they couldn't replicate them. The Germans never knew how American VT fuses shot down 82% of their V-1s in one day. They never understood why their calculations about anti-aircraft effectiveness were suddenly wrong. They never grasped that they were fighting an enemy whose electronics industry could miniaturize radar into a 3-inch shell and produce them by the millions. The Japanese never knew why American anti-aircraft fire became supernaturally accurate in 1944. They never understood why kamikaze attacks that should have succeeded were stopped by shells that seemed to find their targets automatically. They never realized they faced technology their industry couldn't match. By the time they learned the truth, the war was over. The proximity fuse had done its job. Silent, invisible, devastating. 22 million miniature radars that changed warfare forever and remained secret long enough to help win history's largest war. The shell that knew when to explode. The weapon the enemy never understood. The invisible advantage that turned American firepower from good to overwhelming. The proximity fuse won battles without firing a shot. It made every shot fired vastly more effective. And the Germans and Japanese never knew what hit them.